And we are rolling on May 25th, where it's a overcast day in Los Angeles. And we're about to have a policy debate on climate change. Specifically, we're going to debate the question: the U.S. should unilaterally reduce carbon emissions regardless of whether China, India, and developing countries participate. I repeat, the U.S. should unilaterally reduce carbon emissions regardless of whether China, India, and developing countries participate. On the affirmative is Ascario. Oh, that's an N? Okay, Ascanio. And his partner, Lauren. On the opposition, Chandler and Soberia. Sobera. Whoops. Siberia. So let's call this house to order. And we will now hear from Ascanio for a speech not to exceed 7 minutes in length. Here.
Give me a second.
The timer needs a second.
I'll give you. Alright, cool. 1 second. My name's not.
Okay.
Huh?
Begin. You may begin whenever you're ready.
Hi, my name is Ascanio, and this is our policy topic. The US should unilaterally reduce carbon emissions regardless of whether China and other developing countries cooperate. I'm going to start with a resolution or analysis. These are our definitions. Unilaterally, used to indicate that something is done by only one person, group, or country involved in a situation. Multilaterally, involving or participated in by more than 2 nations. Carbon emissions, in terms of carbon produced by humans, this comes from activities like deforestation as well as the burning of fossil fuels. Finally, the criteria for assessing the truth of whether the United States federal government should implement a policy to eliminate CO2 emissions unilaterally, regardless of the cooperations of other countries, should be based upon whether the benefits of our proposal outweigh the costs. So, what is the problem and how big is it? There are 3 distinct problems that we will look at. Firstly, current levels of carbon emission by the US are negatively impacting our environment. The EPA states human activities are altering the carbon cycle by adding man-made CO2 into the atmosphere. Humans are mostly responsible for the warming of our planet and are causing global warming that may soon become irreversible. But our debate is domestically focused. How much of a role does the US play in this? Well, the US produces 16% of the world's CO2. Interestingly, according to the LA Times, out of the top 6 carbon-emitting countries, the United States emits more carbon dioxide per capita, more than double that of China and India. The second issue is that current levels of carbon emissions are negatively impacting the health, physical and mental, of humans everywhere. In terms of mental health, a Harvard study showed that carbon dioxide has a direct negative impact on the human condition, particularly on decision-making performance. On physical health, according to a peer-reviewed article in 2015, by reducing emission from burning fossil fuels, including CO2, we can reduce air pollution and respiratory disease, which can then decrease the rates of obesity, diabetes, and strokes.
5.
The third part of the problem, and what we will focus most of our debate on, is that policies that promote a multilateral approach to reducing carbon emissions come with their own issues. The Paris Agreement is one example of this. It is a treaty signed by 175 countries pledging to reduce their carbon dioxide output. It is a multilateral agreement by our definition. However, nothing about it is legally binding. According to Article 4.2, parties shall pursue domestic mitigation measures. Notice shall but not must. The key issue that we have with this is that the US is spending more money than any other country in the program into the fund, even though it is not the primary polluter. In fact, according to The Guardian, the US has already sent $500 million to the UN's Green Climate Fund and pledged an extra $3 billion. Now, through this agreement, the US has agreed to lower the carbon rates to 28% by 2025, as well as providing funds to help developing nations. But by putting so many funds towards helping other nations, it becomes more difficult for the US to carry out plans domestically. The stringent regulations on energy production imposed by the treaty will also have a significant impact on the US economy. It is expected that household energy costs will rise by 15 to 20% because of the Paris Agreement by 2030. Now, bear with me here. According to the Department of Energy, each person in the US spends an average of $3,000 a year on energy. According to the US Census Bureau, there are 125 million households in the US. If we carry on with this multilateral approach, US households could be spending an extra $125 billion a year on energy, and this is a very conservative estimation. If that money was directed towards purchasing solar panels for houses, that would be enough to equip over 12 million homes with solar energy. At this point, you're probably wondering, what is our plan to solve this problem? Our mandate is to firstly unilaterally reduce the amount of carbon the United States emits and reduce CO2 emissions through a carbon fee and dividend plan. Our means of doing this would be to pass this carbon fee and dividend bill plan, and as a result, green technology would eventually overtake non-renewable energy as a primary energy source. How does this plan solve the problem, and more importantly, how does it work? A carbon fee dividend plan works in a way that will benefit the US both economically and environmentally. This approach works by putting a tax on fossil fuels that gradually rises throughout the years. Once the fee is collected, it is given back entirely to the taxpayers. This is to help them pay for the increased prices of fossil fuels, as well as transition over to clean energy. These fees would, crucially, motivate financing of green technology and research in that sector because of increased demand, thus making them cheaper. This feedback loop would propel the green industry forward. On its efficiency, Lomborg stated that we have found that renewable sources such as wind and solar energy rapidly decrease in price, with wind becoming competitive and solar energy being competitive within 2 or 3 decades. What are the advantages of this proposal? Solution is relatively easy to implement. It reduces CO2 levels, and it allows for the unilateral reduction of carbon for the US, regardless of the cooperation of other countries, regardless of their carbon emissions and whether they cooperate. It also encourages the development of the servicing and distributing sectors of green technology and will boost the overall economy, not to mention improve worldwide health. We believe that the advantages of this proposal greatly outweigh the costs. The United States has an obligation to help the environment and reduce their carbon emissions, regardless of the cooperation of other countries such as China and India. As outlined, it is clear that the plan to unilaterally reduce carbon emissions would help eliminate the environmental harms, as well as improve the health and living standards of people everywhere. Therefore, we ask you for adherence on this matter. Thank you.
I now stand open for...
I stand open for cross-examination and points of clarification.
Thank you. Can you pull the desk back a little bit, and move your desk back? Thank you. I really have to crank this camera back to get your head in the picture. Thank you. Yeah, that's all. Yeah, that's better. Thank you. Stand closer together, please. Yeah, good. Ooh. There we go.
All right. So you claim that the United States emits more carbon dioxide per capita than China or India. Is that correct?
Yes. So
you also make the claim that the U.S. is putting more money into the International Fund than any other country in the program. Don't you feel that this is fair, considering the fact that we are one of the top carbon emitters? Shouldn't we pay our fair share?
Not at all, considering that China produces more than double our share of carbon dioxide. It might be smaller per capita, but overall it is double what we produce in terms of carbon dioxide. I believe the figure is 30% compared to our 16%.
I don't recall that that's what you said. I believe you said that the emissions from the United States were double that of India.
They are in per capita. So on a per capita basis, we produce more carbon dioxide, but there are far less people in the US as there are in China. So the total in China is greater.
All right. I would personally argue that the U.S.'s amount that they're contributing is more than their fair share, that it's equitable.
But so how come China spends less than half on the international fund, whereas the U.S. spends $3 billion?
I can't answer that specifically, but you do raise a significant point. Additionally, when you say that it might be more difficult for the U.S. to carry out its plans domestically based on the amount of money that they're putting in, what sources do you have for that argument?
Logic.
Okay, but you don't have any...
We're spending money on other countries rather than spending it domestically.
Right. Well, are you aware that the Paris Agreement specifically rests on a return on investment? For example, companies like ExxonMobil, Royal Dutch Shell, ConocoPhillips, BP, Total, and more have been outspoken on the importance of staying in the Paris Agreement because they have access to a $23 trillion investment. That's an opportunity for global corporations,
1 minute.
according to the IFC, that we could add that to the U.S. economy. Therefore, we would be putting money back into the GDP.
So how come ExxonMobil will be making money from an investment that promotes green energy?
Because green energy is a growing business.
But it's an oil company.
Yes, but they're an energy company. So essentially...
But weren't, as in your brief, you said that prices of oil and coal would actually rise as a result of Paris Agreement, so wouldn't they be losing money because less people would purchase it?
No, because they're moving towards clean energy.
30
Do you have evidence for
seconds.
that?
Can I rule out of order that you can ask questions of the questioner, okay? You answer the questions. Thank you.
All right. In addition to the $23 trillion amount that could go back into the U.S.'s GDP, rather than losing money, an NR2C report from March 2017 indicates that the Paris Climate Agreement will fuel an additional $19 trillion global surge in economic growth over the next 30 years, which will be up for grabs for any participating country. So if the U.S. withdraws and goes unilateral, then we won't be able to have access to that money.
Answer the question.
I think through the carbon fee and reduction plan that Lauren will further discuss, we could actually profit more from withdrawing from the Paris Agreement than staying in it.
More than $19 trillion.
I think so, yeah.
All right.
Thank you. Okay, the chair now recognizes the leader of the opposition for a speech not to exceed 7 minutes in length.
Hi there. My name is Chandler. I'm the leader of the opposition, and I would like to argue today that we, the opposition, hereby propose that the implementation of the unilateral agreement would be inherently harmful to the United States, foreign nations, and world diplomacy. A unilateral approach to reducing carbon emissions will be moving backward and not forward for the simple reason that we cannot use a unilateral approach while also going a multilateral approach. We've already signed on to the Paris Agreement. Withdrawing from the Paris Agreement will have significant harms. On December 12, 2015, 195 countries reached an agreement on a new climate treaty hailed by UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon as a monumental triumph for the people and our planet. This treaty, called the Paris Agreement, was the unprecedented result of 2 decades of negotiation within the international scientific community. We could not have achieved this feat of international diplomacy without our stepping stone, the unilateral agreement. Individual countries, like the U.S., have in the past decade worked tirelessly on developing carbon reduction plans unilaterally because multilateral agreements have been difficult to arrive at. This has been a necessary step for us towards the end of negotiating a multilateral plan, and the Paris Agreement is that solution. Several attempts have been made in the past to move multilaterally with less success. For example, the Kyoto Protocol in 1997 is the clearest example that we have of what is called global warming gridlock. The legal reinforcement of terms brought the agreement to a standstill, making little difference in CO2 reduction over the years. Now that the Paris Agreement has been ratified by 88% of participating countries, with the remaining 12% set to sign on in the coming years, we must move forward and participate in this groundbreaking treaty. We have a responsibility to uphold the commitments that we have made as a nation, particularly considering that the U.S. is the first largest global economy in the world. We have the largest GDP, and therefore we can afford to. And second of all, we are the second largest emitter of CO2. This would be an equitable share. We would be able to contribute to developing countries reducing their carbon emissions, and overall it would make our planet a greener and safer and healthier place. We can't we can't go forward with a unilateral agreement when the multilateral agreement is already in place. The current U.S. plan for reducing carbon emissions is already set out in the Paris Agreement. We have it signed, it's a done deal. We can choose to not follow through with our commitment, but we would either have to face the music at a global conference or not attend, taking us out of the agreement for good. If we lose our seat at the table, we would suffer significant harms, and essentially it's just a foolish and risky plan. Oliver Gaden of the German Institute for International and Security Affairs asserted that a U.S. withdrawal would badly undermine the Paris Agreement, making any decisions largely irrelevant, due to the U.S. being the world's biggest economy. This would fade the momentum that has taken 2 decades to build and could irreversibly dismantle the Paris Agreement, causing other countries to fall out. Essentially, it would become pointless. If other countries fail to deliver, we will be facing massive economic damage from climate change, both globally and internationally. The cost of climate change itself is major. We need to consider our investment in the future prevention of climate change. We will incur damage globally and regionally from future infrastructure damage to Asian coastal areas that will be underwater due to warming, the financial damage that climate refugees will create, subsequent military and medical spending, and the list goes on. A multilateral agreement is the best hope that we have at abating climate change and thus reducing these future costs. Another reason why it would be a terrible idea to withdraw from the Paris Treaty would be that it would damage our reputation. Basically, to do this would alienate the US from the rest of the world. We've worked very hard to arrive at this decision. It's an unprecedented occurrence, and we would be going an American-first strategy. We would look very elitist, it would be bad for global diplomacy, and we would face major backlash from other countries.
3.
There's still time to turn things around, but we have to respect other nations and move forward with this. So I would like to propose a counterplan, that we keep the status quo. The Paris Agreement has many positive benefits to be reaped by its participants. Maldives Environmental Minister Tariq Ibrahim, chair of the Alliance of Small Island States, urges continued participation due to the clear strategic, economic, and security benefits that we all stand to gain. President Obama, former US President Obama, has called the Paris Agreement the best chance that we have at reducing overall carbon emissions and targeting climate change. We stand to gain rank in the growing renewable energy business. According to Bloomberg New Energy, in 2015, China invested a record $110.5 billion in clean energy. That was twice the amount of the US, more than any other country. This figure shows that renewable energy is increasing and will gain a lot of momentum over the next 30 or so years. Additionally, this investment will create jobs. We will have a lot of new energy tech jobs which are not easily outsourced, which are high paying, and we will have a drastic increase in household income due to the reduced cost of energy bills and a larger national income. Overall, this has not just regional benefits, but also world benefits. It will be better for the environment in the reduction of carbon emissions and the prevention of climate change. It will provide global economic benefits by returning over $19 trillion to the World Fund. And when we look at China as an example, China has signed on to the Paris Agreement. This is unprecedented, considering that China has ignored its own pollution over the past decades. They're in agreement with the Paris Treaty because they know that it's a good economic investment. Essentially, with the multilateral approach, we're addressing the issue head-on. We have a lot of collective problem-solving potential, and multilateral approaches are just preferable to unilateral ones in matters of great significance. It guarantees a coalition of wisdom and interests, ensuring a balanced understanding of the issue and leading to clear objectives for action. This is shown with the UN. In particular, the UN is a great example because it's voluntary and not enforced by law. The UN, since its enactment in 1946, has been very successful in improving world relations, and the Paris Agreement is similar to that in that it won't be legally reinforced. So essentially, my argument is this. The Paris Agreement, as a multilateral agreement, is the best chance that we have to preserve and uphold our reputation as a nation, to take responsibility for the pollution that we've caused, to help foreign nations, and to lead by example. We need to create a better world. Remember, this is global warming. It affects all life on Earth, and therefore we need a global solution.
I now stand open.
Stand open for cross-examination and questions of
Clarification. Thank you. Okay, back from our views.
You said that China knows that renewable energy is the way of the future. Is this correct?
Yes.
So how would you react to the news that they, last year, after signing the Paris Agreement, established a capacity rule which allows one coal-powered plant to be built per week until 2020?
I did not know that information, but I would like to hear more about that.
Right. Well, I'll give you some more information. The United States, on the other hand, is actually shutting down right now more than it is building. Are you surprised by this news as well?
No, not Mr. Philip.
So you said that there will be an increase in household income due to reduced costs of energy bills as the price of clean energy continues to fall. Is this correct?
Yes, that's correct. According to my source,
Yeah. So, but how can you justify this, seeing as the Paris Agreement is going to cause the price of coal and oil energy to rise by 15 to 20% for Americans?
2 minutes.
because essentially we're going to be moving away from coal and other fossil fuels towards renewables, and the massive shift towards renewables will decrease the cost of energy. I have here, evidence that states that the growth of solar energy employment alone will grow exponentially over the next 15 years. There will be a doubling of wind power installed in the U.S. from 5.4% of the power grid today to 20% by 2030, according to Moore's Law. And advanced energy is a $1.4 trillion industry, which nearly meets the amount of military spending annually, which was $1.6 trillion in 2015. At the current rate, we will quickly surpass military spending, making renewable energy one of the largest world industries. And so, in answer to your question, coal and fossil fuels will not be as significant.
I agree, but right now only 10% of U.S. energy sources comes from renewables. And your plan, which cuts carbon emissions by 25% by 2025, is not particularly efficient, because our carbon fee and reduction plan actually cuts down carbon emissions by 50% by 2030.
Well, first of all, the 25% goal is a very ambitious goal, and it would create a huge reduction in carbon emissions.
It is, but I don't think...
I would argue that 50% is not realistic, and additionally, the overall
30 seconds.
The overall amount of carbon reductions from all 195 countries will greatly, over.
You said that our point on focusing on developing new technology is redundant because over $608 million are being allocated to developing clean energy under the Paris Agreement. Is this correct? But what about the $3 billion that are going from the US to the Green Climate Fund, which came about because of the Paris Agreement? What if this money was siphoned towards developing green technology? Or what about the $125 billion extra that US citizens will be spending on energy?
I'd like to see your sources for the last fact that you stated.
Okay, thank you.
Considering that was an estimation on your part.
It was a very conservative estimation.
But you don't have
Okay, she gets to answer, that's all.
You haven't given me a legitimate source.
Look at me, not him. I'm the one you're persuading. Thank you.
I'd like to see an actual source for that as opposed to just ignoring that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. Yes, Dario. Okay, the chair now will recognize the deputy member of the government for a speech not to exceed 7 minutes in length. Hear, hear.
So, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lauren, and we are here today to prove to you that the U.S. federal government should take unilateral action, regardless of other countries, to reduce our carbon emissions because of 3 main problems stated earlier by my partner. So, what are these problems? Well, just to recap, first, current levels of carbon emissions by the U.S. are negatively impacting our environment. Second, these levels are also harming people's health physically and mentally. And third, current multilateral policies such as the Paris Agreement could greatly cause harm to the U.S. economy. So such treaties, such as the ones proposed by our opponents, might not be economically viable for U.S. or taxpayers because the U.S. is already spending billions of dollars toward this cause and helping other countries instead of putting this money toward improving our own green technology and helping reduce our carbon emissions even further. According to the National Economic Research Associates, if the U.S. followed the Paris Agreement and met all of its commitments, it would cost the American economy $3 trillion and 76.5 million industrial sector jobs by 2040. I now want to point out that other countries such as China and India do have plans to reduce their CO2 emissions on their own, and they were even enacted before a multilateral approach, such as the Paris Agreement, was even set in place. So one article by Scientific American found that China has lowered its coal productions to the point where global CO2 emissions have actually stalled. And in terms of India, in a recent pledge to the UN, they offered to reduce their carbon emissions by 33 to 35% by 2030, and this plan again was enacted even before the Paris Agreement was in development. Now, with other countries already implementing change to reduce their carbon emissions, it is now the United States' turn to unilaterally reduce our carbon emissions while also preserving our economy and not falling behind the rest of the world. Now, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, in 2016, carbon emissions in the U.S. have dropped 14% below the 2005 level, proving that we can reduce our emissions without the economic cost of multilateral approaches. So, what is the solution? So, we propose that the United States implement a policy known as the Carbon Fee and Dividend Plan that will, 1, help reduce the overall CO2 emissions in the U.S., 2, reduce emissions in an economically friendly way, and 3, motivate other countries to adopt similar policies. The Carbon Fee and Dividend Plan is the best policy that we can currently implement that will pave the way to greatly reducing our CO2 emissions while also preserving our economy and igniting more policies such as this across the globe to further progress the world to a greener and healthier environment. So now you're thinking, will this plan work? Yes, it will. A carbon fee and dividend plan is very straightforward, simple to use, and has been proven to work in other places such as British Columbia. According to the Carbon Tax Center, British Columbia had almost a 13% decrease per capita in emissions from 2008 to 2013. This was 3.5 times greater than the 3.7% per capita decline that occurred in the rest of Canada. Now, a carbon fee and dividend plan works in this way that I'm going to outline for you guys right now. So first, you place a rising tax on CO2 emissions to decrease the uses of fossil fuels and therefore reducing CO2 emissions. Second, you take all of this money and redistribute it evenly amongst all citizens to help them pay for the rising costs. And then thirdly, you implement a border adjustment to protect domestic businesses and promote production of greener technology. Now, to reiterate, first, the government will place a steadily rising tax on fossil fuels based on the tons of carbon that are emitted from the fossil fuels that are produced. But this is only until green and renewable energy can become efficient and cost-effective enough to become competitive with fossil fuels. Thus, increasing prices decreases the use of fossil fuels, which then decreases our emissions of CO2. Longboard states that if price of solar energy continues its present decline of 50% per decade, it will become competitive by 2030 or 2040. This, of course, will bring about a massive substitution of fossil fuels with solar energy, proving that renewable energy is already becoming competitive. Now, due to this fee, fossil fuels such as gas will inevitably rise in cost, and many people probably won't be too happy about this initially. However, I'm going to propose the solution. So the second part of this approach is that after the fee is collected, 100% of these fees are divided and given back equally to the citizens in a form of a monthly check to help them not only pay for the increased prices of fossil fuels, but also to help them transition over into renewable and cleaner energy. A REMI report on the economic impact of a fee and dividend plan found that most of us would actually pay less in these fees than we would receive in the dividend payments. In other words, we would be receiving more money in these checks than we would be paying in taxes, and who doesn't love more money? This same report also found that this policy would cause the U.S. to gain 2.8 million more good-paying jobs and boost our overall GDP as well as reduce our CO2 emissions by 52% by 2035 and prevent 230,000 premature deaths in that same year, proving that this will help solve not only our economic issues, but also benefit our environment and health as well. And the third part of this plan is a border adjustment, which includes import fees on products imported from other countries that don't have a carbon fee, as well as rebates to U.S. companies that export to these other countries. Now, what this does is it discourages domestic businesses from moving their business to abroad, where they can still emit more CO2, while also directly encouraging other countries to adopt similar policies and motivate them to reduce their own CO2 emissions in order to keep their own economies competitive. Now, what are the advantages to our proposal? Well, by initially starting out with a fee and dividend approach, the U.S. will, 1, reduce its CO2 emissions by encouraging the use and production of energy-efficient products, thus improving the environment and human health. 2, protect and grow a thriving economy by creating jobs and products in a new green industry. And 3, motivate other countries to adopt similar policies and reduce their own CO2 emissions. Thus, a unilateral approach gives birth to a natural multilateral reduction of CO2 emissions. This policy will give rise to a global carbon tax and reduce CO2 emissions much faster and efficiently than a UN agreement that attempts to get countries to adopt greener policies just on their own. If the U.S. begins by unilaterally reducing their CO2 emissions using a fee and dividend plan, the rest of the world will follow. The advantages of our proposal, we believe, will greatly outweigh the costs. Therefore, we ask for your adherence in this matter. I now stand open for cross-examination, points of clarification.
Thank you. Cheryl, now hear a cross-examination not to exceed 3 minutes in length from the deputy member of the opposition. Hear, hear. Stand together. Face me, please. And begin.
All right. So your policy was a carbon tax where there was a fee and dividend approach. In summary, you'll be taxing corporations, and then that tax money will go back into the people, correct?
It's more, we're taxing the carbon that is emitted by the fossil fuels, and then all of this is then collected, so it doesn't necessarily go straight to the companies or anything.
Okay, what happens if corporations decide to increase their price on the product?
Well, that's what it's actually supposed to encourage is, yes, this will increase the prices of fossil fuels, but that is then supposed to discourage people and move not only companies but also citizens away from fossil fuels and emitting more CO2 and transitioning them over to greener energy. And so once fossil fuels go up in prices, this will decrease their demand and increase the demand of more renewable and cleaner energy sources, thus decreasing those prices. So even though it does rise, it will in the end benefit.
Okay.
2 minutes.
So if we don't have any products right now that are green and available price-wise for them, wouldn't it just be a ripple effect, or not effect, but a circle effect where, okay, you tax the companies and then you give that money back to the people, but then you tax the companies and it goes back to the people. But those corporations now increase the price in the product, so really you're not reducing the limit of carbon, because really all you're doing is, sorry, let me read it off. All you're really doing is balancing out the money that you're charging them to the balance of money that they're putting to the carbon.
Kind of. I'll try to answer it. From what I can tell, basically, there are actually a ton of very cost-effective renewable energies, and I also found a bunch of sources that are in my reputation about how there are a lot of renewable energy sources that are already coming up, and as I stated in my brief, Longborg actually believes that a lot of our renewable energy sources will be competitive, so solar and wind will be competitive by either 2030 to 2040. So in that sense, even though the rises of fossil fuels are increasing, there is a lot of evidence that our renewable energy sources and renewable technologies have decreased.
Okay, I'm going to go on to my next question.
No, go for it.
You said that the British Columbia decreased 13% of their emissions, correct?
Yes.
Your source actually states that it's greenhouse gas emissions, so what do you have to say with that? Is it all carbon emissions? Do you know how much actually was reduced from there?
Yes, so it did say it says greenhouse carbon emissions including carbon dioxide emissions, and in that same article or source, it actually states that carbon dioxide is 82.2% of all greenhouse gases. So in that sense, even just reducing greenhouse gases in general, we are still taking down our emissions of carbon dioxide, since it is a very large percentage of greenhouse gases.
Thank you very much. And now the chair recognizes the deputy member of the opposition for a speech not to exceed 7 minutes in length. Here.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sabera, and I am on the opposition side for this debate.
Hi, Sabera.
The topic for this debate is whether the U.S. should unilaterally reduce carbon emissions, regardless of whether the rest of the world is going to reduce it, basically. We as the opposition are in agreement that the U.S. should not unilaterally reduce CO2 emissions, but should do it multilaterally. As both the government and my partner have already stated the criteria, the definitions, and basically why we need to reduce CO2, I'm going to avoid all that and just go straight into the focus of what our solutions are. Now, as my partner Chandler has already mentioned, we believe that multilateral solution is the best option. The first reason for that is the U.S. Is only producing 16% of global emissions. China is producing 28%, with EU roughly around 9%, and India behind with between 6 to 7%. So even if the United States is able to make a small impact on reducing the CO2 that they're emitting, unilaterally, that won't make a difference because 84% of the world's carbon emissions is still out there and it could still be increasing. So it's just balancing it out. Therefore, in order to reduce CO2 emissions, it must be a global responsibility. It mustn't just be developing countries, but it mustn't just be developed countries, but developing countries as well. Lombard agrees with this statement by saying that developing countries are predicted to not overtake, but heavily increase their CO2 emissions as part of the economic development. The second reason we should do a multilateral approach is because their unilateral approach of the carbon fee and dividend plan, which the government stated works in the British Columbia, is not actually working. Their source from the Carbon Tax Center stated that their plan was adopted around 2008, and from 2008 to 2013, they had a drop of 13%. But that plan wasn't adopted until mid-2008, and there's a lot of other focus reasons for maybe that drop that they're not putting out there. So when looking at 2009 to 2014, it actually shows that British Columbia increased their carbon emissions by 4.3%. And during that same time period, a non-tax Central of Canada actually decreased by 2.1. The government website also shows that from 2009 to 2015, in British Columbia, the motor fuel sales rose up to 7.4%. So then what was the point of having a unilateral approach if all you're doing is increasing it and also increasing the fuel usage that they're using? It doesn't work. So proving that, the Paris Agreement has 5 main points that demonstrates why the multilateral approach is the best way. The first point is mitigation. So most nations believe that there is a problem with CO2 emissions, and therefore agree that what must be done is to limit the global emissions to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. If we can reach even lower to 1.5, that would be preferable because who wouldn't want to go lower on that one? Christina Figueroa, the United Nations official of climate change, stated that exceeding this temperature adds detrimental challenges to ourselves and the environment. So along with that, we must also have a national determined contribution plans, which is called NDCs. So what this is, it's a legal report where nations state their goals in reducing emissions. 146 countries out of 196 have already signed on to the agreement. They understand that in order to reduce CO2 emissions, their NDCs must be published among the public and progressions as well. This transparency will illustrate the accountability to reach their goal within each nation. In addition, nations in agreement must meet every 5 years to discuss their ambitious targets, or more ambitious targets. The second point is adaptation. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change states that adapting means adverse effects of the climate change. We must be able to respond to the global effects that are happening now while also thinking about the future. And the third point is climate finance. So in order to mitigate and adapt to the climate change, finances are obviously needed. The policy understands that differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities between the developing worlds are out there. So in order to do that, developed countries are asked to contribute $100 billion a year in order to support the objectives of developing countries. The fourth point is technology transfer, which basically means that all public parties will build off of each other's work by sharing resources, information, and technology. And the last one is capacity building. So in agreement, this means that increasing support to other nations in order to prevent and combat CO2 emissions. Now with all this said, will the policy work? With the policy implemented, we know that nations must be willing to prepare and communicate and maintain their NDCs. China, for example, is the main nation leading the production of carbon emissions, and they have already begun to make improvements. From the Center of Climate and Energy Solutions, China's NDCs include goals like reducing to 60 to 65% of their carbon emissions, while also increasing their share of non-fossil fuels in primary energy consumption to around 20%. To reach their goal, the National Bureau of Statistics of China has shown that China has not only reduced their consumption by 4.7%, but increased their clean energy consumption to about 1.7 already in 2016. Now, my opponent stated that China's reduction in coal consumption has stabilized their CO2. That may have been true, but that doesn't include carbon leakage that's out there. So maybe a country has already stabilized their carbon emission. It doesn't mean that the rest of the world is going to decrease as well. If China, who's producing 30% of carbon emissions, stabilize it, it doesn't mean that 70% are going to decrease. It means that 70% might actually increase it. So whatever China is making in improvements, it's just going to decrease. It's not going to really matter if everyone else is increasing. So basically, therefore, I state, as a member of the opposition team, we have met our criteria as working in the policy agreement for Paris Agreement, which focuses on mitigation on carbon emission through adaptation, climate change, technology transfers, and capacity building. With these 5 points in combination, the U.S. can reduce carbon emissions far more efficiently than doing a unilateral approach.
I now stand open, yes?
I now stand open for cross-examination and points of clarification.
Alright, so you stated that in 2008 British Columbia saw a drastic drop in emissions, yet you argued that we cannot account that big of a drop to a policy that was barely applied at the time. What do you then apply this large drop to, if not the implementation of the carbon fee and dividend policy?
Yeah, so your plan started in the mid of 2008, but what you failed to realize is that British Columbia was in a recession at that time. So if you're in a recession, people are not going to put that much into that product, and therefore only 2008 to 2009 was there a reduction. If you look at your data from your source from 2009 to 2014, every year beyond that is increasing. So if your policy were to work, year by year you should actually be seeing a decrease, but we're not. We're seeing an increase. Therefore, I can't say that 2008, the biggest cause was your policy.
So the second question I have is, you stated that as part of the Paris Agreement, developing nations would be asked to contribute $100 billion a year to support the needs and priorities of developing countries until 2025. Is that true?
Yes.
Okay.
2 minutes.
So how do you suppose that the U.S. will provide its share of the funds, just through taxes?
No,
taxpayers'
actually,
dollars?
the same fund that you guys stated, the Global Climate Fund, that we're already putting $3 million into it, or billion, I can't remember which one it was from your source. That is actually a transferable fund that goes into the Paris Agreement. It wasn't caused by the Paris Agreement, actually that one started in 2010, but mostly that's where we're getting most of our funds from. Also, the U.S. isn't the only developed country that is like putting more money. As my partner has already stated, China, who's a developing country, is putting more money than we actually are. And there's also other places like Luxembourg and other ones that account for that. So really, the U.S. is about 10th to 11th in putting money into that program.
Actually, based on the global climate change, China and India weren't even on there as putting money into the global climate change. And U.S. was in, I believe, the top
1
10
minute.
at least. And then when people are putting, like when countries are putting money into the global climate change fund, we're doing that through taxpayers' dollars. But do you think, you stated that people probably won't be willing to pay our taxes in the carbon fee and dividend plan, but don't you think that people will be more willing to pay taxes that they will then get back later on, and that will help benefit their own country instead of going to other countries that are already have
30 seconds.
implementations of their own to reduce their own carbon emissions?
Well, if they're getting that money back, I doubt they're going to really use it into, like if I get $50 today, I'm not going to use it to go buy solar power. I'm going to go put gas in my car, realistically. So, I mean, your plan is great and all, but I don't think it's going to be efficient. I don't know the rest of your questions. I'm sorry.
But it's also just when you do get the money, it's not only to help you give more fossil, or to pay for the increasing rise of fossil fuels, but it's supposed to help motivate people into more greener and renewable sources. So.
But if it's balancing out, it won't work.
Okay, that's time. Thank you. Okay, that concludes the constructive portion of our debate. It's now time for refutation, which of course involves 4 parts. She said, I disagree because, therefore. We'll begin with the leader of the government, Ascanio.
She said, the Paris Agreement is an investment for our future, but we should look beyond the immediate costs and look at economic growth models. We disagree, because the Paris Agreement is an investment without substance, since no one is legally obliged to follow it. On top of this, our plans are forward-looking, more so than the Paris Agreement. According to research cited by Lauren, a carbon fee tax would reduce the output of carbon in the US down 50% by 2035, whereas the Paris Agreement would only do so by 25%. I would also like to point out that we are looking far beyond the immediate cost because most of our research concerns itself not with the present, but with the future. They said, if we continue to utilize fossil fuels, we will ultimately cede our position to China, who are set to outcompete us in the next 10 years. This will cause us to fall behind in world rankings, allowing China to monopolize the market on renewable energy, effectively damaging our GDP. We disagree because, as we stated, non-renewable energy is getting more expensive. And as I mentioned in my cross-examination, China is still building fossil fuel plants, whereas the US is tearing theirs down. The US also leads the world in clean technology innovation in terms of investment and in patents. In terms of clean energy generation, it is second to the entirety of the EU combined. Clearly, the US is poised to lead the world in terms of green technology. There is little doubt that the major breakthroughs in this sector have and will come from the United States. A proposition to absorb financing from our innovative green sector and give it to other countries who do not have the capacity for innovating like we do seems senseless, especially coming from the opposition who supposedly want the best for our environment. They said, if we don't act multilaterally, the United States will certainly face an economic crisis. Fallout from the effects of climate change will result in a massive economic loss far greater than our proposed investment. We disagree because the UNEP and an article published in Nature both state that even if we follow through with the plan to cut the carbon emissions of all these countries according to the Paris Agreement by that time, a temperature rise above 2 degrees Celsius will occur anyway. So these environmental disasters that the opposition hints at are unavoidable, even if the Paris Agreement is followed to the letter. Both of our parties care about the environment, and we believe that global warming poses a significant threat to humanity. But we are realists. We do know that most of the countries that signed the agreement will not fulfill their pledges. Clearly, a more extreme measure is needed, one that forces the price of non-renewables to rise and green energy to fall. This is why our innovative approach through the carbon dividend fee plan is essential, not only to safeguard the economy of our nation, but to ensure the well-being of future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Ascanio. And now we'll hear from the leader of the opposition, Chandler.
All right. So, the government states that we should not be putting more money into any kind of carbon emission agreement than other countries. We disagree because we feel that the United States is paying its equitable share to reduce carbon emissions globally, considering the fact that we are number 2 in worldwide emissions. The affirmative side also states that it will be difficult for the United States to carry out our own plans to reduce carbon emissions domestically. We disagree because the plan put forth in the Paris Agreement for the United States to reduce its own carbon emissions is exactly the same as it has been already working unilaterally for the past however many years. The government side states that household energy costs will rise 15 to 20% because of multilateral agreements. However, we disagree because there aren't sufficient sources to indicate that this is correct, and in fact, our sources indicate that household energy costs will in fact fall because of the increase in clean energy technology that's set to outcompete coal and fossil fuels by the year 2030. They also state that U.S. households would be spending an extra $125 billion per year on energy if we were to go forward with a multilateral agreement. We disagree because there's significant evidence to prove that households would not be spending more money but actually saving more money because of the increase in clean energy technology, which will be greatly lower than current fossil fuel and coal prices. They've also stated that their carbon fee and dividend plan has been proven to work in other countries. However, we disagree that this is a significant finding because although British Columbia does have an implementation of their plan, there's no indication that this plan will work any better than the plan that we are currently executing, that we have executed both unilaterally leading up to the Paris Agreement and multilaterally now that we are engaged in it. And finally, they, the affirmative claims that overall a unilateral approach is a more sound investment than a multilateral approach.
30 seconds.
We disagree because as discussed and as proposed by our own side, we feel very strongly that a unilateral approach will significantly harm the U.S. in both economic, environmental, and other ways. Therefore, I conclude.
Thank you so much. Chair will now hear from the deputy member of the government. Speech not to exceed 3 minutes in length. Hear, hear.
They said that the Paris Agreement is the solution to ensuring international cooperation to reduce emissions. However, they also stated that the plans of the Paris Agreement will not be made effective until 2030, arguing that we have time to ratify, amend, and refine our side of the argument if terms become impractical without having to go unilateral. Well, we disagree because they argue that their policy is the best and most efficient way to reduce global CO2 emissions. However, the policy of a carbon fee and dividend plan that we propose is predicted to reduce our CO2 emissions by 52% by 2035, while their proposal of using the Paris Agreement has to wait until 2030 until it is even made effective. Therefore, instead of waiting close to another 10 years in 2030 until any action under the Paris Agreement is made effective or carried out to reduce CO2 emissions, we can implement a fee and dividend plan. By enacting our policy, we can more quickly and efficiently reduce our emissions across the globe, as well as encourage other countries to do the same by 2035. Now, they also state that reducing emissions is a global responsibility, and that 146 countries out of 196 have signed on to the Paris Agreement, which shows that it is highly accepted that many countries want to work together in solving this global issue. We actually agree with this. However, we believe that the fact that many countries have signed on to this agreement might suggest that they would be more willing to adopt a fee and dividend plan instead of just signing a non-binding agreement that only holds countries accountable to increase their efforts every 5 years when the Paris Agreement meets up again. Therefore, instead of letting a non-binding agreement slowly push forward our reductions of CO2 emissions, we should implement a fee and dividend plan that will constantly encourage citizens and other countries to continuously reduce their emissions and use cleaner energy sources through these fee and dividend plans. They also said that motor fuel sales rose 7.4% from 2009 to 2015 in British Columbia due to this fee and dividend plan, also stating that people will not be willing to pay this tax and it will greatly affect our economy. However, we disagree because even though these taxes are rising, so is the amount of money that people are receiving through their dividend tax. Also, with the fee and dividend plan, citizens' money in a carbon tax comes back to them, whereas citizens' money in a tax fee that goes to the Paris Agreement goes to other countries. Citizens will want their money to come back to them and help their own country instead of giving it away. Therefore, these higher dividend checks can then be put towards paying these higher prices, as well as helping people transition into adopting greener technology, which, as shown before, is proven to be more efficient and cost-effective. Also stated as earlier in my argument, an economic report found that most of us would actually pay less than we would receive in dividend payments. I hope that after hearing our costs and benefits of the carbon fee and dividend plan that we proposed, you will come to the conclusion that this is the current and most efficient and economically viable way to unilaterally reduce harmful carbon emissions in order to help our environment, improve human health, and improve our economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Chair will now hear the deputy member of the opposition for a rebuttal not to exceed 3 minutes in length, which includes 4 parts.
Okay, so the government side said that having a voluntary agreement isn't going to work. Yet they have no proof for that. So I disagree with that. This is the first time that we ever have a policy where it's all voluntarily based. See, previous years we actually had a legal binding, and that's why China and India didn't agree with it. China and India, let's see, China has 28% of our carbon emission, US has 15%, and then India has about 9%. So that's, China and India concluded, has about 40% of the world's, about 40% of the world's carbon emissions that we're not focusing on. So by having it be voluntarily, we have these NDCs, which basically mean that you can make your own plan for your own goal that fits your company, your nation, and it has to be met by a specific time. That's why it's important to have it voluntarily, because if you have a legal binding, if you say that every country has to have a 30% reduction in their carbon emissions, obviously developing countries aren't going to be able to do this because they can't fit that plan. And maybe some countries would be like, that's not going to work with us. So let's go with something that's actually attainable for our own country. Second, they say that British Columbia was one of their examples that worked for their policy. That was false. The reason why they had a big deduction from 2008 to 2013 was because in 2008 to 2009, there was a recession. So obviously people weren't putting money into things that had carbon emissions like your gas or maybe your energy that you're using in your house. And after that, from 2009 to 2014, every year following that, there was an increase. So we know that their carbon tax wasn't working in any way. Second, that's one example. Do they have any other examples showing that the carbon, or that their policy is working in any other place? They don't. So we're kind of on an equal time. And then second, carbon leakage. So they said that in 2025, the U.S. is going to try to meet their goal, while the policy for ours is going to be in 2030. The difference with that is the U.S. is trying to reduce their emissions for the U.S., but there's still carbon leakage. If the U.S. is able to reduce, let's say, 15% of their carbon emissions, well, how do we know that China is not going to increase that other 15%, making theirs higher? It's going to be detrimental in that. So by having this plan, it's going to limit everyone to something, an attainable goal that they can have. Second, we know it's reducing carbon emissions, but carbon is global. It's a global thing. So whatever one country does, it's going to be instrumental to another country. And that's it, yeah.
Thank you very much. Let's give them a nice round of applause. And now it's time for the judges to individually make their decisions. I invite you to cross the hall and shake hands.
If you're the exercise,
Congratulate your opponent on a wonderful
I think I know. I'm surprised. I also don't know what's happening. I already fucking said it. Now we're doing it. What does that mean?
Basically the worst logic.
No, wait, I heard that. No, I think it's the band.
Speaker. I thought she had a strong part. She was the worst, flow-wise. That's this. You're on this is. I'm not.
So I'm trying to influence.
Yeah.
I'm kidding. Yeah, I mean, I think she was the best overall, but I agree. No, I mean, oh, actually, yeah. But I don't see so.
No. But I guess you know.
It's too hard because they had a good player. Yeah, I know it's hard to get out. I think it's true. Because what if you drive a Hummer and someone else drives a bus? Why would you each get paid?
Yeah. It's like it's like on a bicycle.
Oh, yeah. If you guys fill out your ballots, I can collect them. Or you can pass them over to...
Shit, we gotta do that.
Wait, I did too. No! Right? It's so funny. We can write it now. I don't think it closes. It definitely closes. Yeah. Here you go.
If you want to start counting, just go first. I want you to finish our collection.
I know my teacher's collection really can go with. This is the Abby and Dana show.